So since designs got invented, I think there's always been that big question of what is design. And I think part of the interesting aspect is trying to answer the question, not necessarily getting to a concrete answer. But I do think the tension is rising, and part of the reason why the tension is rising is because, I think for the good and the bad, design thinking has introduced a lot of really interesting dynamic within the design community. On one part, you have designers entering into the board level and really having a chance to impact organizations at a super strategic level. On the other side, of course, you can also see design thinking as a commodification of design. Something that you put into a 3-step process and guarantee something like innovation.
Welcome to Design Drives, your audio experience about what, how, and why design drives things forward. A podcast hosted by Sebastian Gier, together with forward-thinking design practitioners from around the world.
In this episode, we talk with Antonio Starnino, a service designer from Montreal, Canada, originally from Italy, who really caught my attention through a super interesting perspective he shared in a Medium article. In this episode, we talk about the design community at large and how new definitions have evolved in the recent years about what is actually design, and how this was actually driving the success and really largening the impact of design. Hey Antonio, how are you doing?
Doing fine. Yourself?
Great. I'm super curious about your perspectives on the design community and the things that they share that are in common, but also the things that are maybe extremely different. You wrote a super interesting and thoughtful article on Medium on that topic, and we're bringing views and ideas that are actually right in the center of the podcast, the podcast topic and the mission, what, how, and why design drives things forward, and what is the impact and value of it. So I'm really looking forward, and we'll also link the article in the description. But maybe to give the audience a little bit of context, who you are and where you come from and where you live now and what were your experiences. Maybe you can share that.
Cool. Yeah. So who I am. I guess my name's Antonio Starnino. I've essentially right now I'm living in a place called Montreal, Canada. And before that, I was living for 5 years in Italy, so Milan, Italy. And my background is really as a designer, and as a designer sort of evolved in different areas. Started out in graphic design, did my bachelor's in something called design art. So that one was much more around sort of interdisciplinary design. And then essentially got really interested in the design's role and impact in helping shape, I want to say like organizations, and became interested in the role of design thinking in service design. And eventually did a master's in that, actually, in service design in Milan and Politecnico di Milano. I was part of the first cohort in the master's in service design, and that's what I've been doing for probably the past 5-6 years is actively working in a service design role. And so that means working within sectors like healthcare, telecommunication sectors, mobility, government, public sector, and helping sort of use service design as a way of imagining what their service experiences are, both in terms of improving their experiences towards their clients and thinking of new innovative ways to better serve their clients, and then also to sort of improve the way that they work internally and within their organization. And that sort of led me to be really interested in things like capacity building and supporting organizations and building organizations' capacities to become creative from the inside, in order to allow them to actually design services themselves. And so started doing a lot more capacity building, particularly in the past couple of years. And this led to a new design studio that I opened alongside a business partner in New York City called Studio where we're essentially doing a lot of applying design to ways of working. And so trying to understand how we can design new ways of working for organizations, particularly sort of leveraging tools from design thinking or service design, and trying to introduce that within organizations, but then also imagining and understanding better what their work environments are like and helping them redesign their work environments or their processes and also their places in order to sort of foster the sort of ways of working and the new ways of working that they're looking to inhabit. So that's kind of a little bit my life in the past 10 years in 10 seconds. But that's sort of where I'm at now.
Yeah. How's the design community in Canada and Montreal? I assume it's quite different to the Italian one, right?
Yeah. Okay. So compared to the Italian, I think it's been really rich. I mean, in Italy, you were steeped in what could be considered design legacy. And design legacy is really powerful. So when you talk about design, there's an importance there. There's a recognition that it's really important for themselves, for the economy, for a lot of different reasons, right? But it also, I think, can be hold back, let's say, the more progressive forms of design, thinking about the service design or design thinking,
Yeah.
from becoming widespread. And so in Italy, in Milan, as design capital, there's a lot of service design going on, and it's really growing as a field. But when you talk about design, there's still a very strong conceptualization of design as, either fashion design or automobile design, and sort of design as very much as traditional craft-based roots. Whereas in Canada, it's really service design and design thinking is super new. It's growing in the public sector in a very real way. But it's still growing. But there's also an opportunity to sort of shape design in completely new directions. And so I think the way I describe design in Canada is it has a very exciting space for growth, and particularly when you talk about more alternative forms of design rather than just the traditional ones. I think there's a lot of space in a Canadian context to have an impact in that way. So that's kind of where it's at.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, you made these experiences in Milan, right? Being a service designer there, and experience the contrast, in the design community in terms of like how design is understood. What made you switch to service design then?
I think the impact. And so I'm gonna, like, my beginnings of switching to service design were actually just really quite simple. But in my last years in university, I had the opportunity to design a school garden project for elementary school and to see it implemented. But in that project, as a designer, I was designing the garden, but then I was also helping design the sort of instructional design aspects that would go along with it. So learning math and learning history attached to the garden, and then designing the sort of website experience, and then trying to understand how all of these things fit together. And so I got really interested in something that I was calling at the time like macro design, or designing on a wider scale, not just designing individual things, but design how these things can work together in a bigger system. And I was really interested in designing things for multiple stakeholders. And I think that was really it. I think that interest in designing for multiple stakeholders is what led me eventually towards service design, because in service design, you're not just designing for a single stakeholder, but you're designing for the marketing, IT, frontline, so let's say sales, like all these different actors within an organization that form an organized ecosystem that all have to work together and work well together in order to sort of deliver sort of cohesive service experience. And that's really what interested me. And then I got really interested with the idea of working in a more facilitative role. So rather than just being a designer, sitting in front of a desk, sort of shaping or imagining things on my own, I was really interested in stepping into the role of being a facilitator and bringing these people from an organization around the table, and using design as a way of helping them sort of reimagine better, in this case, better service experiences.
Yeah. Do you miss the traditional tools of design you maybe were using at the start of your university and education now in your practices as a service designer?
So I think the things that I miss are actually quite common when I talk to other designers that switched into service design, coming from either industrial or graphic. For me, I think the parts that I miss are the tangible parts of it. When you're designing graphic design and industrial design, you were making something, and then the thing you made found its way into the world, and you could see it, and it was in front of you. In service design, your impact or what you're making is really kind of a lot more diffused. There isn't a one connection there. And so as a designer, when you're sort of used to that sort of making something and seeing that thing be used, particularly by an end user, it's something that you can miss. But on the other side, I still feel like I'm using a lot of my capacities that I gained as a graphic designer into my work as a service designer. I make a lot of maps, I make a lot of models, I make a lot of artifacts that don't find their way to the end user, but find their way to the organizations and help them create alignment. in order to sort of use that as a basis to then make really important decisions. And so I still find myself using my skills. And so it's not a complete sort of abandonment of what I was doing before, but definitely that aspect of making something tangible is what you tend to miss as a
Yeah.
designer when you're switching into service
Yeah,
design.
yeah. I assume, yeah,
Yeah.
also people who made the same transition, would tell the same, the tactile crafts and aspects to
Hmm.
it. You came to the realization of three design schools or three schools of design in your Medium article, which I found super interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe you can share a little
Cool.
bit. Why did you start thinking about it, and why does it matter, and what were the source behind it?
Yeah. And so I guess similar to how I was describing myself before, I've had a really interesting journey in my design career, and it's really gone from starting from very traditional roots
Yeah.
to then getting exposed to a designer's sort of capacities to have a social impact, and really understanding and learning from those designers. There's a strong focus on theory in my bachelor's, and then moving into service design, really getting into design's capacity to innovate and to solve complex business problems. And so within myself in that journey, I've also sort of grown up personally and start to feel a lot of tension in between those three roles. Like, who am I as a designer, and how is what I've done
Yeah.
before influencing what I'm doing now? And how is what I'm doing now sort of an abandonment of what I did before? And what am I gaining? So there was always these strong tensions within me, because I could see, in my work now as a service designer, there was some critical discourses that I was missing that I had when I was working, particularly during my university career, and then those sort of critical discourses um, were also sort of lacking the sort of I want to say the democratic potential that I was bringing into organizations. So I just didn't know what was right within me. And then in the wider design communities, you could start to see these conversations that were in some ways really conflictual between each other. You had a lot of sort of designers that were unsure about what design was, and a lot of these conversations, particularly when designers say something like, everyone can be a designer. I think that's something I've seen sort of spoken about in different contexts, and that creating a lot of conflict within design communities, and be like, no, I've been learning this craft for X amount of years. You can't just say anyone can be a designer. And so there's or like conversations like designers are facilitators,
Yeah.
and so there's been a strong tension between these sort of different communities, and particularly between different designers. So I use Paola Antonelli as an example. She's a very clear example of a designer that's very much grown into a space in which she's quite critical of sort of very traditional design roots that don't necessarily, or designers that don't necessarily recognize their social or cultural impact in the world, but then also very critical about the world of design thinking, and how the world of design thinking might be sort of devaluing design to a certain extent, or devaluing what designers do. And so it just sort of came to me quite, there wasn't, in my blog article, I talk about how there wasn't a strong research behind it. It was much more of an abductive realization on my side, sort of that just sort of came to me. And part of the reason why it came to me was I'm also currently doing a master's in something called human systems intervention, which is around organizational change. And one of the things you learn about within a master's like this is to learn how to rise above the dynamics of or the organizations that you're working with. So you're working in an organization, there are certain dynamics, and you have to learn how to step back and look at things on a wider scale. And that's really the space that I was operating from. And in doing that, I started to realize, wait, there's actually three different schools here, and there's three different conversations that that people are having around what design is. And these conversations are sort of not matching up, and people
Yeah.
are speaking different languages, and it's creating conflict. And a lot of it is because the word design is what's getting thrown around, and there's I guess perhaps a singular belief on everyone's side that there is a single type of design. Even though if you take a step back and you look at dynamics, design is really thriving, and it's really getting explored in a lot of different directions, and a lot of really beautiful directions. And I think if you sort of hold that tension there, there's a lot of space for design to have a really positive impact in a lot of great ways. But that tension has to be held. So that's what sort of prompted me to write that article. And the article was an exploration. And so it was me writing it, putting it out there, and seeing what people thought of it.
And I feel like this tension is a little bit increasing. Confusion is increasing.
So since designs got invented, I think there's always been that big question of what is design. And I think part of the interesting aspect is trying to answer the question, not necessarily getting to a concrete answer. But I do think the tension is rising, and part of the reason why the tension is rising is because, I think for the good and the bad, design thinking has introduced a lot of really interesting dynamic within the design community. On one part, you have designers entering into the board level and really having a chance to impact organizations at a super strategic level and creating a space to speak to people in positions of power in which traditionally designers haven't been able to speak to. On the other side, of course, you can also see design thinking as a commodification of design, something that you put into a 3-step process and guarantee something like innovation. And that obviously doesn't have a sort of positive connotation within the wider design community, particularly with designers that have been working for a long time in doing this. And so that tension is particularly as this commoditization grows and design stops just becoming a sort of niche thing and starts becoming a thing that people are sort of adopting and certifying themselves as to a certain extent. That tension is definitely going to, I think, increase, and particularly increase with designers that have been working for a long time as designers that have studied it, done all these sort of gained a bachelor's in it or a master's in it, and now find themselves sort of their careers getting somewhat devalued by sort of 2-week or 1-week boot camps. I think there's a really great article by John Calco on this as well, quite recently. So there is that tension that's growing, and that tension does grow to conflict, particularly within the design community, and it does create certain camps, or what I like to say, like it creates quite rigid thinking. And so my way is the right way, and the other way isn't right. Which can really cut down on productive discourse.
Yeah, totally agree. I also really like how you were saying you were applying service design or service design methods basically to approach this or define these different views basically that are in the company or let's say in the community of designers. But now maybe at this point the audience is wondering what are the 3 schools of design you concluded. Maybe you can outline the 3 schools a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the first school is the school that I think most people associate with design, and what design's always been associated with is a school I call the Traditionalists. And so this is a school of craft of designers that when you ask them what is design, they look at it through the lens of their craft. Or they might look at it kind of through a poetic lens as well. I'm thinking about designers that are like Massimo Vignelli. And if you read a lot of his work, it's really powerful stuff. But it really looks at design through his lens of craft, through sort of his capacities as a designer. And really looks at design as sort of through this sort of poetic lens, almost as an art. And so for traditionalist design, is very much tied to sort of this artistic endeavor in which the designer has a capacity to create sort of artifacts. And so a lot of design, when you go to Milan Design Week, or you'll see a lot of traditionalist design, right? So it's still really much grounded into sort of graphic or product, or maybe even architecture. A lot of these sort of impacts on design through the lens of their craft.
I would actually say my feeling is it's at most of the design weeks worldwide. I think that is the focus, or that is the majority. I haven't seen a lot of design weeks that are more on the perspective of the different schools you will outline.
Exactly.
So,
and it makes sense because that's what is tangible, and that you can put a chair in an exhibition and people will know it's a chair and they can comment on the chair and they can have a perspective on the chair. And so it makes sense that a lot of design is still there because it's a design that we're exposed to and that we have that we use and that we sort of associate with what design is. The second school is a school that I call the cultural-mediators, and this is a school that obviously is smaller. And this is a school that essentially that still looks at the individual designer, but looks at the impact of what the individual designer has. They look at it almost kind of like a cultural mediation. And so designers don't just make a chair, but they make something that exists within the world and has a sort of societal impact on it. And that societal impact can be one that's obviously environmental. And so cultural mediators have a very strong, I want to say, attention to the environment, and particularly to a lot of social issues that are emerging now. I'm thinking about climate change. But then also looks at the impact of the designer from a social sphere as well. And so what is the language of a designer and their impact on the politics. And so they really look at, if I'm thinking about a designer that really fits exactly into this sphere, like a Paula Antonelli, she's going to be talking about, design's role or the designer's role in helping solve some of the biggest environmental or political issues that are coming up. And it's still very much centered on the capacities of the designer. And so the designer still has a craft. The designer still is as a maker of sense, but the designer, what is a designer, has a much larger significance than just how a traditionalist might view their role, which is very much geared towards the development or improvement of their individual craft. As a cultural mediator, the designer sort of opens up and is much more aware of their wider impact.
Yeah.
And so this is also one of the more critical schools. And it's also, I think, the school that a lot of, let's say, design academics fall into. And so a lot of the discourse or a lot of their ways of speaking or talking about design will probably make them fall into this sort of second school.
I agree.
And then the third school is probably the newest one to have emerged. And I think it emerges a little bit off the backs of something like people that work within or that could fit into school number two, but it's a school that's really emerged out of, I want to say, the IDOs of the world. And so it's design's impact design's impact to be innovative. Also thinking about solving social problems, also thinking about solving organizational systems problems. But the second school is called sort of the innovators. And part of the reason why they're called this is because they believe design's democratic capacity. They believe designers aren't just a sort of artists in the room sitting back and speaking to themselves to a certain sense, or speaking amongst themselves in a designerly way. They really look at design's influence or capacities to give that power to several people or to communities, really, to help them design new innovative solutions to problems that they're facing. And so, this is why, in a sense, in terms of design thinking or IDEO's version of design thinking, for example, I'll use them as the easiest example, it's the clearest, is really like breaking it down into these sort of 5 steps. And part of the reason why they break it down to these 5 steps is to create a methodology, to create a set of tools that then allow other people to be able to participate as part of the design process. And so, innovators tend to have this very strong participatory lens. And really I think the mantra is obvious for someone that's really deeply rooted in the school is a deep belief in terms of the fact that anyone can be a designer, and that design's true purpose is to be spread amongst a wider sort of community. And so there's this aspect around design and innovation, and that's sort of what led design being used as a very core strategic tool. So a tool that enters into an organization, a tool that's being used for innovation, a tool that's being packaged into 1 week or 2 week workshops, and then sort of used to help sort of solve business problems. And so here, you're really sort of disassociating yourself from design's craft-based past, and really looking at design as a way of you're looking at sort of ways of working as a designer and sort of extracting that and using that as a sort of innovation tool. And so people that are grounded in this school of thought really look at design as a form of innovation.
Yeah, I really like how you outline and conduct these 3 categories of understanding design. I really also agree to the 3 perspectives. What is your personal view on design, and how, like, which school you would put yourself?
So I don't know if I have I think stepping back, I'm not sure I have a very strict personal definition of what design is or should be. I think as design evolves and evolves in these different directions, I sort of just really understand and look at design's impact as its ability to make people make the world a
Yeah.
better place, really. So maybe and whatever levels that might play at for people. But in terms of what school I tend to find myself into is a little bit into school number two. I think I'm really quite interested in I want to say the impact or the role of the designer and their capacities to solve these really deep social issues, and also the capacities to sort of understand it from a much more theoretical or academic lens. Um, that being said, I find myself obviously working majorly as a designer in school number three. And I think that part of the
Yeah.
reason why I do that is I think it's just a really strong interest in yeah, I think in design's capacities to bring communities together to solve really complex problems. And I find myself often working within school number three quite a bit, and then perhaps leveraging things from school number two to understand how that works or why that works, or understand my own role as a designer. Um, because I'm just seeing myself sort of being able to impact much larger projects, and then also being okay with not being so clear on this being a very defined, tangible, designed outcome, like you might have within project number two, or sorry, school number two or school number one.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. There might be a gradient
Yeah.
between these schools, and I think a lot of people maybe say there would be in not just one school but like in two, or maybe even three. But you also were outlining some of the dynamics when it comes to the collaboration, the attitudes between these schools. How do they collaborate with how does school number two interacts with school number three, or how these different perspectives of design interact with each other. I think this would be super cool to outline for the audience.
Sure, yeah. And so I think one of the things I brought in as a way of looking at this is I think a model that I learned particularly in human systems intervention, which is the sort of Thomas Kilmann conflict model, or conflict indicators. And so essentially the model speaks to the idea that each person has their own tendency in situations of tension and conflict to act within a certain way. And one of the other things we learn is that beyond just the individuals, entire system in this case, or entire communities, can actually have their method of dealing with conflict as well. And so if I'm looking at the three schools, each of these three schools sort of have their own ways of dealing with this sort of conflict. And the first school, the traditionalists, tend to be what we call the sort of conflict avoiders. They tend to be the people that sort of step away and just don't engage in discourse, or their discussions, or they have conflictual conversations and tensions, but the tensions tend to be reserved to their own individual craft, and so they're going to be talking about their own world, or their own stuff that's happening within their own space, but they're not necessarily going to enter into a wider discourse on what design is. And so that's a whole school that we don't necessarily hear from very often, and you don't really hear their perspective on things. The second school tend to have a conflict model that is very much what we call the competers, and so this is a conflict model that seeks conflict out and draws it in. And so they're the ones, particularly in cultural mediators, because a large part of cultural mediation. I also say in this school fits in people that come from the world of critical design. These are the people that are going to outright call people out. They're going to sort of tell them how they feel. They're going to be like, this isn't design. This isn't how design should be. Or, they're going to be really critical around the two other schools if they feel that they're not necessarily engaging in a way that they feel might be ethically or politically correct. And so, Paul Antonelli will call out the traditionalists because they're not necessarily embracing their potential or impact within the design context, or they're not necessarily operating from that from a viewpoint of what their impact is as a designer, but then she'll also sort of speak against the sort of design thinking community that tend to devalue design. And so like really they're really quite open to conflict, and they're not afraid of it, and they draw it in. The third school tend to become what I call the compromisers. Not what I call, but in the model it speaks to as compromisers. And so they're the people that will try to find a way to find the peace. And often, in my view, in the third school, it's really a peace within themselves. But for example, like they're not going to be close to other methods. They're not going to be close to other tools, or they're not going to be closed off to just how, I mean, just the other ways of working. And so, for example, like a really clear, let's say, design community within the second school is a speculative design community. Speculative design community really comes in and they look at sort of possible futures as a way of creating critical discourse, and they take it really seriously, right? And Paul Antonelli is firmly rooted within that community. In the third school, we'll look at speculative design and be like, that's super cool. Let's take those elements and bring it in. And be really open to trying new things and to bringing it in, but bringing in perhaps in a way that you could say might be seen as superficial from the people that have been practicing this in a very deep way. And so in the third school, they tend to compromise. And so whenever there's a conflict or a conversation around what design is, they tend to try to take and pull from different sources and to try to mash them together into a compromised sort of solution. And so even IDEO, when people were really being critical around design thinking, or there's been a lot of criticism around that, they're going to be like, yeah, I can understand that there's been some issues and there's been maybe some superficiality, but in reality, this is also this benefit and this is the other benefit. And so they're not going to fight back necessarily. They're not going to, start to say like, actually, you're wrong. Like, we really believe in our things for X, Y, and Z reasons, and really stand by their positions. They're going to try to find a compromise around it so that they can still not burn their bridges to a certain extent.
Yeah, super interesting. I really like how you outline this, how they interact with each other. I think it would be also interesting where you think is the industry heading at large. Which of these schools are rising, and where you see the industry is heading. Maybe I think if you look at universities, how are they changing? Maybe there's also a trend seeing. So I'm really wondering about your perspective on that.
So I guess I'll speak to this at the top of my intelligence, but I might be also completely wrong. So I think design in universities is evolving in really interesting ways. I mean, there's the individual, I think, design programs or design-centered programs that are also having, if I'm thinking about the program that I graduated from in terms of my university and my bachelor's, they've been really sort of firmly rooted within their, I think I would say, the identity of talking about design as a cultural mediator. And so I don't think that's necessarily changed. And I think for many universities, I'm thinking about programs like transdisciplinary design at Parsons or many interdisciplinary design programs. I think they're still going to be really firmly rooted within trying to create design programs that help bring a new awareness and a new impact. I think you're always going to have the traditionalist schools, so schools that are that teach very deep craft-based ways of working. But I think where the biggest change within universities is going to come in, and it's just because of the sheer scale of how it's growing, is particularly in the third school. Design is innovation. It's still not massive, and you still don't see a lot of, I want to say, traditional designers jumping into the innovations field. But suddenly they're starting to talk about and teach design within business schools. And suddenly, design thinking is starting to find its way within organizational schools. And suddenly, design isn't just relegated to design schools or design programs, but suddenly it's becoming a sort of lingua franca in the sense of programs outside of the traditional sectors of design. And so whereas I think in universities, I haven't necessarily seen a big trend towards embracing different schools of thought beyond their realms. I've been seeing other programs suddenly start to embrace design because the innovation community within design has really made that democratic for them, and they've really done it in a way that they've understood it, and they're able to take methods and tools and apply that to their work without necessarily having to rechange or redo the structures of where they're at. And so that's been the biggest shifts in terms of where the design is heading at large. And for sure, that has an impact on the smaller, not smaller, but like on the other schools, like let's say the more traditional design schools, because it's been impossible for them to ignore. And so they've had to also sort of understand what that means for them, and to a certain extent also bring that in, albeit within their lens. But so, for example, maybe a graphic designer might start to think about facilitating co-creation workshops with their clients, whereas before the relationship would have been very much, I have a meeting with you, you tell me what to do, I design something, and then that's it. Now you have branding studios that are embracing things like design innovation methods or strategic design methods, in order to sort of improve their relationship with their clients, but then also sort of bring their clients as part of the process. So I'm thinking about something like a Wolf Allens, for example, that when they're doing a branding project, it's no longer just the expert designers that think up a new brand strategy and present it to their clients. Now they're actively bringing their clients into co-creation sessions or workshop sessions, very much influenced by the innovation design community, in order to help them, rethink and collaborate together towards coming with a new brand. And so it's much more of a partnership, much more of a co-creation. And that's been really interesting. I think that's been the biggest influence and most positive influence, if you want to say, from school, the third school, the innovation school, is it's really taken designers out of their sort of protective shell, out of the studio to a certain extent, and really had them understand that, in fact, no, the best way to come towards something is to actually look at it as a co-creation, and a co-creation between stakeholders that might not necessarily have been traditionally connected to the design process before.
Yeah, I think this is super interesting. Also, if you look in how design studios or consultancies reposition themselves in the last years, you can also see this trend. For example, calling themselves now. Every agency is now calling themselves, strategic design agency, not just a design agency. So there's also this trend on the repositioning, I think, on of designers, but also agencies.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm wondering a little bit about, you were touching on this, intersection of schools a little bit, and I'm just wondering a little bit, where you think there's an advantage of this diversity of opinions and perspectives, or you think it's good actually, that there are multiple perspectives on this, or does it more bad than good? Just wondering a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm always of the belief, and maybe the belief could be a bit naive, but I'm always of the belief that diversity is always a positive.
Yeah.
As long as it's allowed to flourish, and as long as it's not allowed to be suppressed or controlled. I think the conversation that's being held around what design is and how design is evolving is a positive one, and I think it definitely helps build a more collective understanding between different parties. And I really like talking about it when I have that chance to talk about it with people that I would say are from different schools, because there's always different perspectives that emerge. And so I actually think that the strength of this is to not necessarily put strong boundaries, and not to say design has to move towards a certain direction, but rather start to understand what have been the positives that have come out. So similar to what I said, the positives of the innovation community has been this sort of space where co-creation is a much bigger has a much bigger influence. In this case, the role of critical mediation is that we need to be able to have those critical discourses as a designer. We can't just sort of either look at things through an insular lens or a myopic lens, or look at things through a very sort of superficial perspective. And so each school brings with it a really important perspective and advantages and disadvantages to their approach. And I think when you allow for that diversity to flourish, then those positives grow along with them. The only thing is that we don't understand what the positives are and what the negatives are unless you're having a productive conversation around that. And so that's basically where I'm sort of at, is that the diversity is super important and needs to be maintained, and these three schools of thought needs to grow. But we also have to have an openness and conversation between each other and a dialogue on what the positives and what the negatives are, because I can agree that, taking design and commodifying it within a 3-day workshop can have a lot of advantages in terms of exposing an organization to the value of perhaps different ways of thinking, but it can also, in a sense, either devalue design, or in a sense, design can be co-opted as a sort of super solution or silver bullet to an organization's problems, which it's not. And that's the dangers. And then what ends up happening in that case is that it obviously eventually doesn't pan out that way. And then sort of people are like, well, we tried that design thing and it's not working, when it's not really a thing, but it's an actual sort of really valuable approach and method, and not just methodology, but just sort of mindset. And so these are always the dangers that come up in all three areas.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when reflecting on your views in the article, I think I was also thinking that it's actually good that there are three different perspectives. It's just how they're collaborating and the learning between them. It's more like a cake. It's not that like three different cakes, but it's one cake with different has different parts to it, right? And it needs all parts to it and all perspectives actually, to make it complete. And I think they're all doing their part. Maybe I
was gonna say, when you have the awareness of the cake, I think that also makes it much more interesting, because you're not just you're growing within your own area and your own sort of focus, but then you're also aware of how your area and focus might either collaborate with, connect with, or might not connect with other areas and focuses. And so that becomes, having an awareness that there's a broader design community, and that broader design community has its strengths and weaknesses, really allows for I think really allows for anyone really to sort of look at what their own individual impact is, and look at ways that they could either better collaborate, or create, or at least add a new piece of the conversation to the conversation of what is design.
Yeah, and I think this diversity is one of the reasons why design is so successful as it is at the moment. If you would just have stay with one perspective, for example, like the traditionalist, how it was for many years, and I think the way we broaden the understanding of design is like one of the reasons why it's so successful. But the downside is that it becomes much more confusing. But I really like how you point out the direction how to create more unity in there.
And I would reframe confusion with ambiguous. And part of the reason why I would do that is just because it's design right now is really ambiguous. And I think it's and as human beings, we're not very good with ambiguity. We generally try to figure out and become very certain. And that sort of, let's say, for example, if we feel ambiguous, we're going to try to make the situation that we're in more certain. And so when design feels ambiguous, that means that we can become really drawn into our own individual camps and to become more stuck there. And so whereas there's, I think, a general feeling of confusion, in reality, I think that's much more of a connection to, or a reaction to, perhaps, the ambiguity that they feel. And so a lot of this is also being open to and resting in the sort of ambiguous nature of what design is, which is kind of ironic, because often in innovation communities, they talk about the dancing with ambiguity, or being in ambiguity. And then I think that and then they become very sure about their own ways of being a designer. So I think it's about using that, taking that and looking at it from a broader design perspective, and being okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Really like it. I think what's also interesting is looking at different disciplines. We're just wondering if you reflected on that as well, because I think you were saying you're coming from a service design. You're practicing service design now, so you may be more in school 3. But I think also you could if you look at different design disciplines like fashion, product, architecture. I think there's also diversity when it comes to these schools.
Yeah, and this is why even though I separated it into these 3 schools, I was really careful not to necessarily peg down. I think there's certain disciplines that fall more naturally into these 3 schools. But there's also that versatility or adaptability that someone that's an architect can look at things through a cultural mediation lens, or can look at things through an innovation lens. someone that's including someone that's like a fashion designer or product designer as well, or even a graphic designer can look at the work they do through a lens of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there isn't a particular structure. It's more about their viewpoints of what design is, and so that's kind of how I've approached it in terms of like the differentiation between design communities and how between design disciplines and how these design disciplines might approach the three different schools of thought. But for sure, a lot of it is cultural as well. And so when you're steeped in fashion design, for example, a fashion designer that goes to school in fashion design and stays in the fashion design community will tend to have adoptions of a traditionalist, just because culturally, it's all about fashion design. Now you're starting to see fashion designers also look at their impact and role within a wider community. Sort of sustainability, fashion movement, for example, is a big example of that. So starting to look at what their impacts are, and particularly around sort of fashion as a platform for innovation. Fashion designers are also starting to understand their role or their role or capacity as designers to be able to innovate on top of business models and to act as sort of, we talk about design leadership, to look at their role in that sense as well. And so there's that evolution as well, that's happening. And I think one of the interesting things as well is that we're also starting to see really interesting mixes within the design communities.
Absolutely.
And maybe we can take that from the space of innovation and co-creation, but we're starting to see different multidisciplinary design communities emerge. And something like a Parsons is a really great example of a transdisciplinary design program that doesn't just say, there's one type of design or another type of design, but it's like, well, what happens when you mix all these different types of designs together along with a social science or along with the hard sciences, for example, and what emerges from that. And I think that exploration is a really exciting thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as like you said, if you start to mix these, categories with each other, I think they are really unique contributions that people can make. Also, like you said, for example, if somebody from a traditional fashion design background, more practicing from a school 2 or 3 perspective, I think that's now like very valuable and unique contributions. I think or somebody from maybe from a service design background, then collaborating with somebody from school 1 to make it tangible in the end. I think the mix between these schools and also disciplines, I think it's super interesting, and I think there can be really unique positioning of designers.
Yeah, especially when you look at a field like data visualization. There's like such really beautiful data visualization artists right now that are really blurring those lines. Like they are developing data visualization, so very much focused on that sort of graphic or the information design aspect of it, but how they're getting this information is coming through sort of data through digital data, and so that's forcing them to have to sort of open up into different fields, and they're also understanding that sort of data visualization is becoming a tool engine for people to understand and make decisions, and so that sort of entering into much more innovation discourses. And so what's really cool is starting to see people that are jumping between the 3 schools and pulling stuff from these 3 schools and not just getting stuck into their school. And that's like amazing, because the impact of that is really positive.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually had a data visualization person, Shan He, actually on the podcast 2 episodes ago. She started to do data visualization at Uber and leading the practices there. And also had a really diverse background from design, architecture, mathematics, so probably also along all 3 schools. Yeah. I wonder what we as a design community have to change moving forward to ultimately drive positive or have positive impact in this world and drive things forward. What would be your advice to the design community?
Be open, be aware, be curious, have conversations. If you're a graphic designer or a UI designer, and you're really into your craft and you're really doing your craft and you're doing that thing and you're attending all your conferences, UI conferences and all that stuff, be really curious to other design communities and what other design communities are doing, and particularly really curious to these other different design schools and what they might be talking about. So I think that would be the first thing I would say in terms of really improving yourselves as a designer. And part of that is going to be that, you might be open to different ways of doing things, and that might influence how your practice grows, and it might probably influence how your career grows as well. And so I'm thinking about that through a traditionalist round. If you're coming in from a design innovation space, like, you have to be really curious in terms of how does a graphic designer work? How do what is their craft based perspective? Because it can be really common for design innovation people to just sort of focus in on their ways of doing things, their methodology, the sort of 5 steps in terms of developing design process, but become really curious in terms of how other designers are actually working in the field and their ways of working. And you're going to be really pulling out a lot of interesting perspectives and ways of thinking that you're able to bring into the design, your innovation projects. And then the last case, in terms of the traditionalist, I think there can become a perspective that, that criticality is really missing, but then also very important, but then can also put a wall around you. And so how do you build that bridge? I think if you're someone that's like sort of deeply rooted within sort of thinking about design and from a cultural mediation standpoint, how do you build that bridge is going to be very important, because I think their contribution is really important, because they bring in the perspectives that make sure that people understand the impacts of what they're doing, and understand how what they're doing is impacting a societal, environmental level. And without that perspective, we're just sort of chickens without our heads, and we might just be doing stuff in a direction that might not be positive to the long-term picture of our communities. And so this perspective is really important, but if it comes in through a very sort of you're doing it wrong attitude, then they're just going to sort of shut themselves out. And so I think part of this is I think the cultural mediators, perhaps more than anyone else in terms of the design community, should be the ones that are being open to creating these discourses, inviting these different people into the room together, and bringing in their strong perspective on things, but then also being open to understand how other people are viewing the situation as well.
Yeah, I also agree. I really like, for example, when it comes to design conferences, actually to attend to conferences that are not maybe in my home base of design discipline. Actually, I find this always much more valuable to me to go to a design conference that is where I maybe gain knowledge that is more repetitive, or I hear things I learned before.
Yeah.
I think this really helps to broaden the perspective and get empathy about other disciplines. And I really like how you connected it to that this is actually a way to largen the impact designers can have, because I think there's a really connection here. Maybe as the last question, what do you think is the ultimate impact design or designers can have?
I think in the end, we're living in a society that is ultimately designed. It's man-made, or not man-made, I would say, just people-made. So we're living in a society that's designed in many ways, in which we are either impacted by or directly influencing the design decisions that we have on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes those design decisions are actually a lot broader, a lot more micro than we think. And sometimes they're just like the things that we buy that influence design decisions on a broader scale. Or sometimes they're the things that we use that we don't necessarily notice could have a positive or negative impact on us. So I think design's ultimate impact is to help move us towards much more positive and much more beneficial futures for everyone, for all of our communities, for humanity as a whole. Just because, I think if there's one distinction to humanity, it's our capacities to make and to make things that we live in and that we sort of use on a daily basis. And I think the exciting aspect of design over the past century has been this recognition and this sort of appreciation that there is a craft and that there is good design and that there is something to be held for, creating something that has a positive impact in terms of the actual use, but then needs to have a positive impact in terms of our futures as a community, as human beings, and in terms of the environment that we're in as well. And so I think that's the ultimate impact of a design if you're really looking at it at a macro scale, and I'm sort of looking at it at a macro scale. And then at the other part, I think the great thing about design on an individual level is that it helps us be more intentional.
Yeah.
You know, and I think when you're really doing good design, it means that you're being a lot more intentional with decisions that you're making and why you're making them, and the impact that they might have, and you're becoming more conscious. Yeah, and so I think that the great thing about teaching design and looking at design as a mindset is that you're becoming much more intentional and much more open to perhaps exploration and divergence, and just trying new things, hopefully, and exploring new spaces. But particularly the important part is that intentionality, and I think that's what design can bring, at least on an individual, personal level.
Yeah, I really like how you're pointing out, how design is driving a more intentional decision making across industries and problems. Really liking it. Yeah, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you, Sebastian. This has been a great experience for me.
That was the episode. If you want to give us feedback on the podcast, have something to contribute to the next episode, or just want to get in touch, feel free to connect with us either on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram messages, or simply via the designdrives.org website. We love to hear from you.